Hello everyone, I'm Caroline, and I'm excited to share my story with you, despite it being a bit hard to talk about. You see, in reality, I actually hate sharing things about myself with others. It's hard to explain, but have you ever felt like you just didn't like being around people, and even seeing them or talking to them gets on your nerves? Well, that's exactly how I feel every single day. You might be thinking, what a cold-hearted girl, right? But trust me, it's not like that at all. Stay with me, and I'll explain everything to you. My story begins with my parents. Like most people, my parents dreamt about sharing their world with a child and building a beautiful family. I was their little baby, and that is why I was spoiled. Like, embarrassingly over-the-top spoiled. Looking back at old photos, I could see that my parents had given me every single thing I had ever asked for. However, all of these things were just materialistic. The truth was, they never made an effort to focus on my personality and interests. And this is where the problems began. Up until I was in first grade, life was pretty peaceful. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, so I never had to go to kindergarten before starting school like all the other kids. Because of that, I never really socialized with other kids. So you can probably imagine the nightmare I went through when I started school and suddenly had to deal with all of these other people. I had to listen to every single child screaming and being hyperactive. I was in complete shell shock. And on top of all this, an older kid approached me and he tried to hold my hand. He smelled so bad and his hands were dirty. I got scared and pushed him away and started hysterically crying. I made such a scene. And shortly after, my mom arrived to pick me up and took me home. On the way back home, I was shaking uncontrollably. I was traumatized. I thought to myself, that school was a place that I never wanted to go back to ever again. My mother didn't quite get what was happening. She was so confused. You might be thinking that I was being overly dramatic, but the truth is I really hated it there. And after that incident, it didn't get any better. Of course, my weird behavior seriously worried my mom, and it just got worse when the school counselor called her and said that if I kept failing to engage with the other kids, the school would need to take some measures and investigate if the reasons for my odd behavior were because I was coming from an unhealthy home. They were even suspicious that I might have been getting physically abused. That really put my poor parents in an awkward position. A position where everyone thought they were mistreating me. My parents started blaming themselves for my social awkwardness and my lack of interaction with people. It was such a difficult time. My parents had done nothing wrong in raising me, and they were just absolutely clueless about why I was acting so strange. One evening, my parents and I were having dinner in peace when suddenly we heard a loud knock on the door. They were knocking nonstop. The noise was unbearable. I remember hiding behind the couch and covering my ears with my hands. When my dad opened the door, a police officer came in and said that my school's counseling committee had assigned him to run a surprise checkup to make sure I was doing okay. However, when the policeman saw me, I looked anything but okay. Anyone who saw me in that state, hiding behind the couch, cowering in fear, would have been extremely worried about me. That night, my parents were arrested and forced to spend the night in custody. And I was taken to a little room and questioned by child services. They asked me so many questions, and I was very uncooperative. Hours turned into days, and eventually they began to realize that this wasn't about my parents, and that I was just a strange kid who was quite simply afraid of everything. After that, people started talking. Rumors were going around about my parents, but most of the gossip was about how much of a weird child I was. The child who caused her parents to spend a night in prison. Unfortunately, I hated myself since I was a little child, and I hated being this weird and awkwardly quiet person, and it never went away as I got older. In fact, with time, that became my sole identity. The weirdo, quiet girl. I even used to believe that I was a bad person. I mean, if I was a good, decent person, then why hadn't I just let the social workers know that my parents had done nothing wrong? It felt like the whole world was against me, and it continued in this way until I became a teenager. I was never able to express myself, talk to people, or socialize in the slightest. I was just totally awkward all the time. Imagine feeling like there was no place you could go to when you felt sad. No place you could retreat to feel safe from the world. I felt so completely out of it. I just didn't fit in anywhere, it seemed. There was no place for me in this world. These dark thoughts haunted me all the time, and I couldn't escape from them. However, one day, I found something that gave me comfort. I started drawing, and it helped me empty out some of the negative energy I had stored inside me. Getting involved with art started helping me tremendously. Even my mom had noticed how much I enjoyed it. She encouraged me to continue. And after a while, life stopped being that harsh. In fact, lots of things got much better. I was making art and people were appreciating it. Not only my parents, but also my art teacher who expressed great admiration for my work. I finally felt like I belonged, like I'd found an outlet to express myself through. My paintings and drawings started attracting a lot of attention from everyone, and my school started displaying them in their art gallery. The more people liked my work, the more I felt I fit in. Eventually, I couldn't stop. I spent every waking moment painting, and some nights I didn't even sleep. I just painted all night long. A local gallery in our town asked me if I'd be interested in running an exhibition, and I agreed. I didn't realize the mistake I was making, though. I spent weeks preparing for it. I completely isolated myself and painted nonstop. When the day of the exhibition came, my mom took me to the gallery to set up, and as people started arriving, I started panicking. That's when I had my first panic attack. I don't remember much of what happened next, but I just know I fainted and my parents had to take me home. The exhibition I'd spent so long preparing for went to waste. I didn't even get to be there for the opening. My parents were seriously worried now. The doctor contacted my school and had them give me some time off. They said I'd had some kind of burnout and needed to rest and recuperate. For the next month, I spent all my time in bed. I didn't even paint. I just surfed the net and slept. One day, I decided to look up my symptoms, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. Why hadn't I done this earlier? It explained everything. According to the search results, I had autism. I was devastated. I'd always known there was something wrong with me, but I didn't think it could be something like autism. For the next few weeks, I just lay in bed in the dark, feeling miserable. Pretty soon, I also stopped eating. I didn't want to do anything anymore. Life felt hopeless. I was so weak I could barely even walk to the bathroom at the end of the hall. One day, my mom forced me to go for a walk with her out to the garden to get some fresh air. On the way downstairs, I fainted. My mom rushed me to the hospital, and they ran a bunch of tests. They made me stay overnight so they could monitor my health. One of the nurses was really kind to me, and I found myself opening up to her. I told her that I had autism, and she looked very surprised. She ran off to get a doctor. They came over to me and assured me that I definitely did not have autism, and that other than a weakened immune system due to lack of nutrition, I was perfectly healthy and that they just wanted to keep me in for a few nights to monitor my eating habits. I started crying. I'd gone my whole life so far feeling like an alien, and finally I'd found autism and was so sure that that's what I had. And now this doctor was telling me I was actually fine and healthy. I felt so confused, as if I were back at square one, back to being that awkward weirdo girl. The doctors left me to try and calm down for the night, and then I heard a voice from behind the curtain. There was a girl about my age standing there, and she asked if she could come in. Even though I felt vulnerable and shy, I said yes for some reason. She sat next to my bed and introduced herself as Celine, and started explaining that she was also here because she'd stopped eating and her parents had been worried about her. As I listened to her talk, something inside me shifted, and I felt like for the first time I could actually communicate with someone. I started talking to her about my art and how I felt awkward around people, and she said she felt exactly the same. Soon we realized how much we had in common, and I went to sleep that night smiling. I finally had a friend that understood me. It was the best feeling in the world. The more I got to know Celine, the more I felt I belonged. She made me feel that I wasn't so strange after all, and that just because I'm not the most social person on the planet doesn't mean I'm any less of a person. It's honestly crazy to think I've gone all these years identifying as a weirdo, when in actual fact it's just my personality and I'm just different from other people. We can't all be super bubbly and outgoing. I wish I'd met Celine earlier when I was a kid. But then again, sometimes we need to go on these self-growth journeys alone, and better late than never, right? Here's to friendship.
Hi, I'm Annie, and I can't recall a single moment of my life without being with my sister. My sister Emily has been sick since she was a child. Even though our family can afford a full-time caregiver for her, I was the only one who took care of her. You might be wondering why my sister could just drop down and die if I left her side. Well, she has chronic kidney disease and severe anemia that requires constant blood donations, and the only person she can get that blood from is me. I'm surprised I've got any blood left, to be honest, and let's not get started on the number of times I've fainted. But I never complain about it. Not once. Emily is my best friend, and I would do anything for her. But sometimes it was a bit weird, because to put it bluntly, she was my only friend. I don't even know what it's like to have friends. People thought that we were weird, like that first time I took her to a support meeting. I was holding her hand nonstop, and when she stood up to introduce herself, I stood up with her. I heard someone whispering that we looked like a couple, and the others started laughing. After the meeting, we went together to the toilet, and the same people were watching us. "She's my sister, all right?" I shouted. When I looked at Emily, I noticed she was crying. My sister was very sensitive. That night, I hugged her and promised that I would never leave her side no matter what. The next week at our meeting, I left Emily to go to the bathroom for 1 minute, but on my way back, I got the fright of my life. My sister had disappeared. I started screaming her name. Everyone looked at me like I was insane, but suddenly, I saw her body lying on the floor in the next room. Was she dead? Ben, the guy in charge of the meeting, was sitting with her. He told me to relax and that she was okay. He called an ambulance and said it was on the way. It took us to the hospital, and he came along. Ben was very sweet, actually. He waited in the room with me and never left our side. The doctors told me that my sister's blood pressure had dropped and that she can be released in a couple of hours. Ben invited me for a cup of coffee while we waited. He then asked me, "So what's the deal with this weird relationship that's going on with your sister?" I didn't feel like answering his question, so I put my head down and tears started running down my cheeks. Then I felt his hand touch my chin. He lifted my head up and dried my tears. He said it was okay if I didn't want to discuss it, and he just gave me a hug. He cheered me up and we started chatting about random stuff. He was actually very cute, and before I realized it, he was flirting with me. And I kind of liked it. I felt him leaning in like he was about to kiss me, but then I heard a voice shout, "What do you think you're doing, young lady?" Ugh, it was my mom. I was surprised that she remembered she had a sick daughter and came to check up on her. I told Ben that I'll see him later to save myself the embarrassment, and I went with my mom. She seemed more upset about seeing me with a boy than the fact that her other daughter was in the hospital, but I was used to it. For some reason, I wasn't allowed to date, and my parents were very strict about it. After that, I thought about Ben the whole week, and eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I Googled his name, found his number on the chronic kidney disease support website, and texted him. I had to do it when my sister was sleeping, or otherwise she'd ask who I was texting. I hid my phone under my pillow and waited for a reply. I could barely contain my excitement when I heard my phone buzzing. We started texting back and forth, and he asked me if we could meet for a proper date. I so badly wanted to say yes, but I couldn't go without my sister. But then he said he'd make a plan. So at the next meeting, there was a guest speaker, and Ben asked me if I could help him prepare some tea and cookies for everyone. My sister said she'd be okay, and so that's how I found myself alone in a kitchen with Ben. The moment we were alone, he didn't wait and just leaned in and kissed me. I felt like I was in a dream. We started talking, and I felt like I could open up to him. I told him about my situation, what my parents had taught me, that sisters should be there for one another all the time, and how that's the only way I know how to live. Ben just looked at me and said, "But what about you? When do you ever do anything for yourself?" But I couldn't reply. I had never truly thought about myself before, because thinking about myself felt selfish. The following day, I woke up to some bad news that shattered my world. My sister was transferred to the hospital, and the doctors told us that her kidneys were not responding to the medication anymore. One had completely failed, and if she didn't get a donor ASAP, she will die. I sat there holding her hand, sobbing. Our parents, on the other hand, smiled calmly and said, "Why, we already have a donor. Annie will happily oblige and give her sister one of her kidneys, won't you, dear?" They went on and asked how soon it could be done. I was gobsmacked. They didn't even ask me. For all I knew, they might have signed me up for a complete organ donation. "Sure, doc, take my kidneys. Take my liver. What else do you need?" My mom wasn't even looking at me. She just asked what I needed to sign and when they could schedule us in. But the doctors stopped them and turned to me and said, "Annie, is this okay with you? Do you agree to this?" My mom butted in and said, "Yep, of course she agrees." And then I just lost it. For the first time in my life, I stood up and shouted, "No, I don't agree. I don't agree at all. You never ask me what I want." Then I stormed out of there, shaking in a fit of tears. My mom shouted after me that I was a selfish brat, but I didn't care. That was the first time I'd really left my sister. And I almost turned back to get her, but I wanted space. Actually, I wanted to see Ben. I called him and asked if we could meet. I didn't even look back to see if my parents were coming after me. I met Ben at a cafe and told him everything. On the one hand, I wanted to save my sister's life, but on the other hand, what about my life? It felt like all I did was look after her. Ben said he'd never come across any case like this before, and that my parents weren't treating me right. He said he felt suspicious about it all. He started asking about how my parents treated me when I was a kid. I told him that I thought they were like all other parents, super strict and not particularly interested in me. Then I mentioned that they never even kept any photos of me, that I'd looked, but only found photos of my sister. He said that something seemed wrong. He's been working in this field for a while and he never encountered such a weird family. He said he could look up my sister's files and find out what was going on. I asked if I could come with him because I didn't want to go home. Well, I was in for a shock. He looked up my sister on the records and then said something weird to me. "Annie, your sister's file shows no sign of her having any other siblings. It's like you don't exist on her records. You're definitely related, right?" I assured him we were, but then he looked in my records, and from the expressions on his face, I knew something was wrong. "Annie, it looks like you're not her biological sister. You're adopted." I couldn't believe it. That had to be a mistake. All I knew was my family. I had no memory of being anywhere else or living with any other parents. I felt like my world was crumbling around me. He showed me my file, and sure enough, 17 years ago, when I was a 1-year-old, I was adopted. I wanted to puke. How could my parents lie to me all these years? Ben drove me home, and as I walked up the path, my mom came running out and asked where the heck I'd been and said my sister needed me. I just waved my file in her face and said, "Explain this!" She looked like she wanted to faint. Then the truth came out. After she gave birth to my sister and realized she was sick, they decided it was too dangerous to have any more children, as both their genes meant their kids were at a higher risk of having a chronic condition. So they decided to adopt a baby so their little girl wouldn't be all alone in the world. Because they were so rich and donated loads of money to the orphanage, they were allowed to choose which baby they wanted. Their only request was that the baby has the blood type O. Ah, yes. Now the truth really came out. They adopted me to save their precious little girl's life. They'd used me all these years and didn't care if I got sick from donating a kidney, as long as their own flesh and blood daughter survived. I couldn't bear to stand there another second. I ran out in a rage, and my sister sat crying on the sofa. Ben said I could stay with him, and we could even file a report about my parents. I was so angry, but all I could think about was my sister. What if she died? Was I really the only suitable donor? Now that I'd had a taste of freedom, I didn't want to go back to being with her 24/7, but the thought of life without her was unbearable. I knew what I had to do. But the following week, I got a text from my mom saying, Your sister is about to die. She won't accept you as a donor. You are the most selfish person I know." So I called the hospital and asked them to pretend I was an anonymous donor and try to get my sister to accept it that way. They said she'd refused mine because she'd felt so guilty for everything I'd been through. But maybe this anonymous one would work. The surgery was set up for the next week. But then a shocking event took place. The hospital called and said that my sister's body was shutting down and that she needs the donation ASAP. I hurried to the hospital. My sister was already in the operating room unconscious. They prepared me for the surgery, and after a few hours, it was done. I asked the doctors to put me in a separate room because I didn't want her to know that it was me. The surgery left me very tired. I don't know for how long I was sleeping before I opened my eyes and saw my sister in my room, sitting in the hospital chair. "It was you, wasn't it? They told me it was an anonymous donor, but I know you too well, sis." I started crying immediately. I've never been so happy to see my sister in my life. The transplant was a success, and I don't regret it for a second. Ben and I have said to my sister she can stay with us whenever she wants. And the best part, I can finally go to college knowing that I saved my sister's life. And of course, now I never have to see those nasty people who raised me ever again.